Good evening. Tonight's story is not fiction. It's a real case, dark, unsettling, told step by step for those who remain awake when the world outside is quiet. If stories like these keep you listening, subscribe, like, and tell me where you're tuning in from. Now, lock your front door, lie down, let the AC hum. Pull the blanket close, but leave one foot uncovered. Science shows it helps your body cool down and fall asleep faster. Rain begins. At first, a faint tap on the window, then a steady rhythm. In the small college town of Corvallis, Oregon, the 24th of May 2004 began with sunlight spilling through green canopies and the scent of fresh-cut grass. Brooke Wilberger filled a bucket with water, ready to clean the outdoor light fixtures at her sister's apartment complex. It was her summer job, nothing dangerous, nothing that hinted how suddenly life can vanish. She hummed softly, a habit when she worked alone, unaware that someone was watching. By noon, the neighborhood had slipped into its usual calm. Students were gone for break, lawns glistened after a morning watering, and the world seemed harmless. When Stephanie, Brooke's sister, stepped outside to call her in for lunch, she saw only the bucket, a folded towel, and Brooke's white flip-flops scattered near the post. One strap torn, mud pressed into the plastic as if dragged. Her sister's car sat locked, phone and keys inside. That image froze time. Stephanie's voice broke as she called for Brooke, her words dissolving into the silence of empty courtyards. She dialed 911, her hands trembling so hard she dropped the phone. Within minutes, the first patrol car arrived, siren cutting through the quiet campus air. Officers marked off the area, photographing each footprint, each blade of grass bent the wrong way. The sky dimmed as clouds rolled in, as though the day itself recoiled. Neighbors emerged from their porches, whispering questions no one could answer. How could a girl disappear between one breath and the next? Her sandals, the bucket, the smell of detergent, all that remained of a routine morning. Stephanie kept staring at the car door handle, the tiny reflection of her own face, looking back at her. The search began immediately. Local police, campus security, then volunteers fanning out through the wooded trails. Helicopters circled, dogs barked through the rain. Forensic teams collected fibers, soil, anything that might speak later when witnesses could not. By nightfall, floodlights turned the parking lot into a stage of dread. Every sound a dripping gutter. A distant siren sounded like a clue that refused to reveal itself. At the Wilberger home, her mother pressed Brooke's photo to the kitchen window, whispering prayers into the glass. Her father paced, making lists of who to call, what to print, where to search. The ordinary world had folded in on itself, leaving only questions. A single missing girl had become the center of an entire state's heartbeat. Outside, the rain steadied, erasing footprints, washing away the thin traces of certainty. In that sound, something unseen moved closer. The first shadow of a predator the town had never imagined. Good evening. Tonight's story is not fiction. It's a real case, dark, quiet, and unsettling, told piece by piece for those who listen while the world outside sleeps. If stories like these keep you awake, subscribe, stay close, and tell me where you're listening from. Now, lock your door. Let the hum of the air conditioner fill the silence. Pull your blanket up, but leave one foot uncovered. Science says it helps you fall asleep faster. The rain has begun again, a soft rhythm against the window. In the calm of a May morning, Corvallis, Oregon, moved at its usual pace. The streets were slick, the air smelled of damp grass, and the day promised nothing but peace. At the Oak Park Apartments, Brooke Wilberger, a kind and determined young woman, carried her bucket of water toward the courtyard lights she planned to clean. She had only returned home from college a few days earlier, grateful for rest, grateful for the quiet. She could not have known that someone was watching her from nearby. Hours later, her sister Stephanie called out for her to come in for lunch. No one answered. When she stepped outside, the courtyard was still. Brooke's bucket sat where she had left it. A white flip-flop, broken and streaked with mud, lay in the grass. Her phone, purse, and car keys remained locked in her small car, parked in its usual spot. The scene felt wrong, like a painting missing its subject. Stephanie called her name again. The sound faded into rain. She reached for her phone and dialed emergency services, her voice shaking as she spoke. Within minutes, officers arrived, their flashlights cutting through the mist. They marked off the area, recorded every footprint, and collected the smallest fibers from the wet ground. The air smelled of metal and detergent. A chill passed through everyone standing there, not from the weather, but from something heavier. Neighbors gathered under porches, whispering. The news spread faster than the rain. A girl had vanished, just a few steps from her car, in daylight. People began checking their locks, glancing behind them, wondering what they might have missed that morning. The world felt different now, narrower, more fragile. As night settled, floodlights turned the courtyard into a harsh stage of white and shadow. Police dogs barked in the distance. Volunteers in raincoats searched the woods, calling Brooke's name into the wind. Inside the Wilberger home, her mother pressed a photo against the glass, whispering for her daughter to come back. Her father listed every place to search, every friend to call, every road to cover before sunrise. The hours crawled forward, thick with fear. What began as an ordinary morning had turned into the longest night the town had ever known. Every small sound, a dripping gutter, a car door, a siren made hearts jump. Somewhere beyond the rain, the answer was already moving, silent and unseen, leaving only questions behind. The morning after Brooke's disappearance, the town woke under a low ceiling of clouds. The news spread through radio static and local whispers. A young woman gone without trace. Reporters gathered near the apartment complex, their umbrellas dotting the parking lot like dark flowers. Stephanie stood behind the yellow tape, her face pale, her voice nearly gone. The night had stretched forever, and still there was nothing. Police moved carefully across the wet pavement, collecting photographs, sealing evidence in small numbered bags. Every object felt heavier than it should have: the broken sandal, the damp towel, the water still pooled in the bucket. Forensic technicians scraped under car handles for fingerprints, combed through drains for fibers. The rain had erased much of what they hoped to find, but something in the air told them this was not random. Detectives began mapping Brooke's final hours, noting every conversation, every movement she made before vanishing. Friends described her as gentle yet strong, the kind of person who smiled easily but held firm beliefs. Nothing in her past hinted at danger. No fights, no threats, no reason to run. That calm, ordinary history made the silence around her even more sinister. Stephanie's hands shook as she spoke with investigators. She told them Brooke would never leave her work unfinished, never disappear without a word. The officer nodded, writing in a small notebook already damp from the drizzle. When he stepped away, she stared at the ground where her sister's flip-flops had been found, imagining the struggle that must have happened in those few seconds. By midday, volunteers from the university arrived, students and parents carrying flashlights and thermoses of coffee. They moved in groups, calling Brooke's name through fields and wooded trails. The forest answered with nothing but rain and the whisper of branches. Helicopters passed low over the rooftops, their blades stirring the air like restless thoughts. Inside the temporary command post, maps were pinned to the walls with red lines tracing possible routes. Officers discussed theories in calm voices that betrayed their fatigue. One mentioned the term abduction, and the room fell quiet. Outside, Stephanie heard the word through a half-open door and felt her knees weaken. That single word changed everything, no longer missing, but taken. As evening returned, the searchlights came on again. Reporters spoke into cameras, their voices steady while their eyes betrayed unease. The image of Brooke's smiling face now appeared on every screen, every street corner. The rain continued, patient and endless, washing the chalk from the sidewalks where her name had been written. Stephanie returned home only long enough to change her soaked clothes. Her mother sat at the kitchen table, untouched tea cooling beside her. They spoke little. There was nothing left to say that could make sense of the emptiness. Outside, a police car idled near the curb, its lights dimmed, a silent reminder that the search was far from over. In the distance, thunder rolled softly, and somewhere beyond the reach of searchlights, the person who had taken Brooke was already fading deeper into the dark. The following morning broke without sunlight. Gray clouds hung over the valley, holding the weight of more rain. In the parking lot of the apartment complex, search vehicles came and went, their tires grinding over wet gravel. Reporters stood in silence, waiting for an update that never came. The smell of coffee and damp soil filled the air. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked once, then stopped. By now, the whole town knew Brooke's name. Her photo was taped to shop windows, pinned to church boards, printed in the morning paper beside words that did little to capture what had been lost. Strangers spoke to each other in grocery lines, recalling the girl they had seen jogging, smiling, holding a cup of lemonade at the summer fair. Her absence connected people who had never met. Local businesses donated food for the searchers. Volunteers worked through the night, guided by flashlights and determination. The sound of their boots in the mud became a kind of heartbeat. Even the most skeptical officers began to admit this case felt different, too clean, too sudden, too quiet. The usual signs of struggle were missing, but the sense of deliberate purpose hung in the air. Detectives reviewed security footage from nearby roads. A van appeared in the background of one frame, dark green, windows tinted. It passed by too quickly to read the plate. One officer leaned closer to the monitor, freezing the image, tracing the outline of a sticker on the back door. The discovery sparked a new energy. A single vehicle had now become the thread holding their hope together. Stephanie sat with her mother in the command post, watching the footage in silence. The detective explained what they knew, which was still almost nothing, but he promised they would find her. She nodded, but her eyes stayed fixed on the frozen frame of the van. The world had narrowed to that one shape on the screen. Night came again. The searchers returned, their flashlights flickering through the rain like scattered stars. Some cried quietly, others refused to stop looking. In a nearby diner, officers sipped black coffee, their notebooks smeared with damp ink. They spoke about leads, about witnesses who might have seen a van on the highway, about how little time they might have left. Every hour felt stolen. The town of Corvallis no longer felt familiar. People locked their doors early, checked their windows twice. Parents walked their children to school. Even the sound of footsteps on the sidewalk seemed sharper, suspicious. A predator was among them, and the rain, once comforting, now felt like a curtain hiding something watching back. Stephanie stood outside the apartment complex before dawn. wrapped in her sister's jacket. The air was cold, the sky still dark. She whispered her sister's name, just once, into the wind. Somewhere, far beyond what the searchlights could reach, something shifted. The case was about to change. The investigation had now stretched beyond the quiet streets of Corvallis. Detectives worked in shifts, their eyes heavy from nights without sleep. The search radius widened to nearby highways and forests. Yet, amid the exhaustion, one lead surfaced that changed the rhythm of the case. A name whispered through local chatter. A man who had once lived only a few blocks from where Brooke vanished. He was called Sung-Ho Kim, a former resident known for late-night walks and an obsession with photographing strangers. His laptop, seized after a prior complaint, had been returned months earlier. When investigators reopened the file, they found hundreds of images labeled with initials and dates. Many were of young women in parking lots, at laundromats, on campus lawns. None of them knew they had been watched. Officers obtained a warrant and entered his apartment, the faint odor of mold and burnt coffee greeting them as they pushed through the door. The curtains were drawn tight, the walls plastered with newspaper clippings about missing persons. On his desk sat the same model of bucket found near Brooke's sandals. It could have been coincidence, but the sight of it froze the lead investigator in place. He turned to his team and said only one word: collect. Stephanie was informed later that evening. Her mother wept quietly beside her while detectives described the evidence, careful not to promise too much. They had learned from experience that early relief can break hearts twice. Stephanie nodded, her hands locked together, whispering that if this man was the one, she wanted to look him in the eye. At the station, Kim spoke in a slow, detached voice. He admitted to following women, but denied ever touching them. The digital evidence told another story: chat logs, deleted folders, encrypted drives. Specialists worked through the night, decoding fragments of erased files. Among them were GPS coordinates, camera metadata, and images taken near the same complex where Brooke vanished. Each discovery drew a darker outline of the man sitting silently in the next room. When morning arrived, the air in the station felt heavy. Detectives reviewed their findings and realized a strange pattern. Every set of images ended abruptly, followed by weeks of inactivity. It suggested something interrupted his routine, something that might have frightened him or driven him away. That inconsistency made them doubt. Could they be chasing a shadow while the real predator remained free? Outside, the town waited for news. Rumors swirled, anger grew, and the hope of closure tangled with fear of mistake. The press printed his face before charges were confirmed. Protesters gathered near his apartment, shouting under gray skies. Inside, the man refused to speak further. He simply stared at the wall, lips pressed together, as if he already knew how easily guilt could be assigned to the wrong person. By dusk, the district attorney called for patience. The lab results were still pending, and the van in the footage remained unidentified. The sense of progress that had lifted spirits the day before now dissolved into uncertainty. Stephanie watched the evening rain slide down the window of her parents' car and whispered that it did not feel over. Somewhere, someone else was waiting for them to look away. The man once believed to be the answer was released before sunrise. The evidence, though unsettling, could not hold him. His digital files revealed voyeurism but not violence, fascination but not proof. Forensic analysts found nothing connecting him to the vanished girl, and with every hour that passed, the investigators' confidence thinned like fog over the river. When the news broke, anger rippled through the town. People wanted a face to blame, a name to tie to their fear. Instead, They were left with the same silence that had haunted them since that May morning. Stephanie sat in her parents' kitchen, the blinds drawn, the phone ringing with reporters' questions. She ignored them. The detectives had warned her that the investigation might take months, but her heart refused to accept that kind of waiting. Every night she returned to the parking lot, walking the same path Brooke had taken. Sometimes she imagined hearing her sister's footsteps beside her. Sometimes she spoke into the air, asking the darkness to give her something back. The turning point came from a state far away, in a small desert town where the air burned during the day and cooled to silence by night. A young woman stumbled into a gas station wearing torn clothes, her face bruised, her voice barely above a whisper. She told the clerk that a man had tried to force her into his van, but she escaped when he stopped for fuel. The description of the vehicle made the clerk call the police. When officers arrived, the woman repeated what she had seen, painted on the van's side a green color so dark it looked black in the light, with a dent near the rear door. The story reached Oregon within days. Detectives compared her statement with the footage from Brooke's case, and the van matched. The woman's testimony was precise. The driver was in his 40s, dark hair streaked with gray, polite in a way that made her uneasy. He had introduced himself as Joel, offered her a ride, and turned off the main road minutes later. The details were clear enough to form a picture, one that felt far too familiar. When a background search for men named Joel with prior abduction attempts came back, a name stood out: Joel Patrick Courtney. He had lived in New Mexico, worked odd jobs, and served time for assault. He was now being held for an unrelated attack on another young woman. The coincidence was too close to ignore. Investigators from Oregon flew south to speak with him. Inside the interview room, the man smiled as if the whole matter amused him. He listened to the detectives describe Brooke, then tilted his head and said softly, "You don't really know what you're looking for, do you?" The room went still. He spoke about the drive north years earlier, about a girl who fit a description he pretended to forget. He did not confess, not then, but every word seemed chosen to remind them that he controlled the story now. When the detectives left the prison that evening, the sun had already vanished behind the desert hills. One of them said that the eyes of a liar and the eyes of a predator sometimes looked the same. Another replied that it did not matter, they would find the proof. Back in Oregon, Stephanie received the call. She stood at the window, her reflection staring back at her, and whispered that maybe this time they had found the right man. Yet the rain outside seemed to disagree, tapping softly, as if warning her that the worst part of the story had not yet begun. The next chapter of the case began not with hope, but with fury. The town had grown tired of uncertainty. Months had passed since Brooke vanished, and patience was wearing thin. Every morning, the newspaper carried her picture beside headlines that offered nothing new. When the name Joel Patrick Courtney reached Oregon, it struck like lightning through the fog. People wanted him tried before they even heard the evidence. Detectives traveled to New Mexico to confirm what their instincts already told them. The man sat across the table in a gray jumpsuit, his hands folded, his expression calm. He seemed smaller in person, yet there was a quiet defiance in his posture that chilled the room. They asked him about his time in Oregon. He smirked and said he had passed through once, just long enough to stretch his legs. When they showed him photographs of the parking lot and the van, he leaned forward slightly and said, "I remember the rain." The words alone meant nothing, but the tone unsettled them. Forensic technicians matched his DNA to evidence recovered from another abduction case that bore striking similarities. Fibers found in his vehicle were consistent with materials from Brooks' clothing. Piece by piece, the case began to tighten around him like a slow-moving storm. Back in Corvallis, the Wilberger family received the update with trembling restraint. Stephanie wanted to believe it, but belief now felt dangerous. Her mother prayed while reporters waited outside their driveway, cameras glinting under gray skies. The anger in the community had turned into a kind of hunger for justice, for revenge, for something to balance the unbearable loss. The district attorney prepared the paperwork for extradition. The process moved slowly, tangled in legal details, but every signature carried weight. Journalists filled the courthouse steps. People held candles in front of the church, where Brooks' photo still hung, rain dripping down the laminated paper. The pastor spoke of patience, of truth revealed in time, yet even he could feel the storm brewing behind each bowed head. In the command post, detectives pinned new maps on the wall, marking routes Courtney might have taken. Each red line crossed rivers, highways, and forest trails. They replayed his interviews, listening for slips in his voice, counting the pauses, noting every flicker of arrogance. His record painted a picture of a man who moved often, leaving behind confusion wherever he went. One detective, exhausted from weeks of travel, looked at the file and whispered that justice was no longer enough, that what they needed now was confession. But confession requires remorse, and the man they faced had none. When confronted again with the evidence, he smiled and said, "You already know what happened. You just can't prove it yet." That single sentence ignited something in everyone who heard it. The search for truth became a pursuit of rage. The officers returned to Oregon with new determination, vowing that the next time they faced him, it would be in court. Stephanie watched the news that evening, the rain sliding down the window beside her, and whispered that she could feel the walls finally closing in. Somewhere in the darkness, far from the cameras and the prayers, the man who remembered the rain sat waiting, confident that the storm had only just begun. The courthouse smelled of wet paper and old wood polish. Outside, the sky was the color of steel, rain pressing down in a steady whisper. Inside, the Wilberger family waited in a narrow hallway, the hum of vending machines echoing faintly behind them. Each time a door opened, cameras flashed, capturing grief for strangers to study later. They had grown used to that, the way sorrow could become public property. The first hearing for Joel Patrick Courtney was brief. The judge read charges in a low voice, while the man stood motionless, eyes fixed somewhere beyond the ceiling. When asked if he understood, he nodded, a small movement that carried no weight of conscience. Stephanie sat in the second row, her mother gripping her hand hard enough to leave marks. She wanted to stand up, to shout at him, but the courtroom's silence was too heavy. Afterward, the lawyers spoke in measured tones. The defense argued for time, for paperwork, for procedure. The prosecution wanted none of it. They had waded through months of speculation, and patience had turned into exhaustion. But the system moved at its own pace. Evidence still needed verification, witnesses had to be prepared, and every motion delayed the day they hoped for. Stephanie began keeping a journal, each page filled with details that others might forget: the smell of the rain that morning, the pattern of the courtroom floor, the faint tremor in her mother's hands. She wrote because it made the chaos smaller, something she could hold. Her father spent evenings reviewing files sent by investigators, determined to understand what the legal terms meant, how a man like this could move through the country unnoticed. Outside the courthouse, the town gathered again. Candles flickered beneath umbrellas, faces lit from below like soft lanterns. People held signs that read, "Justice for Brooke," though none of them really knew what justice would look like when it finally arrived. Some imagined peace, others imagined punishment, but most simply wanted the waiting to end. Weeks turned to months. The defense filed motions, questioning evidence, claiming contamination, suggesting other suspects. Each filing reopened wounds. Stephanie learned the language of frustration: continuance, objection, postponement, words that sounded like walls closing in. The trial that should have brought clarity instead deepened the uncertainty. Reporters continued to visit, their microphones wrapped in plastic against the rain. Some spoke gently, others asked questions that felt like needles. Stephanie answered only when she had to, her voice calm but distant. She had discovered that grief can make you sound strong even when you are breaking. At night, she dreamed of the van, not the man. She saw it parked beneath streetlights, raindrops sliding across its surface, the color shifting from green to black and back again. Each time she woke, she told herself that the dream was a reminder, not a prophecy, that the road to justice, however slow, still led forward. Then came the notice of another delay. The trial would not begin for many more months. The reason given was paperwork, but everyone knew the truth. The defense was buying time. In the silence after the announcement, Stephanie looked at her family and realized that anger had become their only fuel. The fight for answers had turned into a war of endurance. Outside, thunder rolled over the valley. Somewhere beyond the courthouse walls, the man responsible sat in a cell, smiling faintly, as if he could feel their frustration from miles away. The rain returned, tapping against the windows like a metronome counting down to something inevitable. The air inside the courthouse had changed. What once felt cold and distant now carried the scent of something approaching resolution, though no one dared to name it aloud. The prosecution had returned from a private meeting with a look Stephanie could not read, half victory, half disbelief. Her father noticed first. He asked what had happened. The answer came in a whisper. The man who took Brooke wanted to make a deal. For months he had sat in silence, answering nothing, his expression steady as stone. But now, with the death penalty on the table, he had begun to talk. His attorney reached out first, offering information in exchange for life without parole. It was a bitter trade, justice without final punishment, truth paid for with mercy. The district attorney wrestled with it for hours before agreeing to hear what he had to say. When the detectives entered the interview room, Joel Patrick Courtney smiled, that same calm smile that had haunted every witness. He spoke slowly, as if savoring each word. He described a drive north through the rain, a girl walking across a parking lot, a moment of impulse he called opportunity. His voice never rose, never trembled. He said her name once, softly, as though it belonged to him. He led investigators to a stretch of land hidden by trees, the kind of place where time forgets to move. Forensic teams arrived with shovels and ground-penetrating radar, their faces drawn tight. Stephanie waited at home, praying she was wrong about what they would find. When the call came, her mother dropped the phone before anyone could speak. The search had ended, but the pain had only shifted shape. The following day, the district attorney stood before cameras, his voice careful, professional. He explained the agreement, how it ensured the man would never walk free. Some called it justice, others called it surrender. To the family, it was both. They had their answer, but no comfort came with it. The weight of knowing was heavier than the uncertainty had ever been. At the prison, the man signed his confession with a steady hand. He asked for a cigarette afterward and laughed when told the facility was smoke-free. He said he did not regret talking, only waiting so long. When the officers left the room, he hummed under his breath, a tuneless sound that carried down the hall long after the door closed. The press turned the story into headlines of closure and relief. They printed photos of smiling detectives, of the wooded area now wrapped in yellow tape, of Brooke's senior portrait framed beside a single white rose. But for those who knew her, those words felt hollow. Closure suggested an ending, and endings belonged to stories, not to lives that were taken too soon. Stephanie spent the next night in her childhood bedroom, staring at the glow of the streetlight through the curtains. She thought about how easily people can disappear, how the world keeps moving around the space they leave behind. She whispered her sister's name once more, this time not as a plea but as a promise that the man who confessed would never again see freedom, and that Brooke would not be remembered for how she was taken, but for how she lived. Outside, the rain began again, steady and unrelenting. Somewhere far away, in a cell built of concrete and regret, the man who once called himself Joel closed his eyes and smiled, believing he had won something in the bargain. What he could not see was that the town he left behind would never forget, and that memory, in the end, would be the punishment he could not escape. The day the search ended, the sky refused to clear. The air carried the scent of wet pine and distant smoke as cars lined the narrow road leading toward the site. The investigators worked quietly, each step measured, each word weighed. When they found what they had come for, no one spoke. They simply stood, heads bowed, letting the moment settle. The wind moved through the trees like a sigh. At home, Stephanie sat on the couch beside her mother, both holding the same photo. Brooke smiling in her graduation dress, sunlight caught in her hair. The phone call came just before noon. The detective's voice trembled when he said they had confirmed what they feared. Stephanie listened without breathing. Her mother made a sound that was not quite a cry, more a release of everything she had been holding inside since the day her daughter disappeared. The following morning, the family was escorted to the site. The road wound through farmland, past fences covered in moss, ending at a clearing where wildflowers struggled to bloom. The air was heavy with the quiet reverence that comes when a long search finally finds its ending. Stephanie stepped forward first, kneeling beside the earth, her fingers tracing the damp grass. The world around her faded into stillness. She whispered a promise that no one else could hear. News crews gathered at the edge of the property, their cameras respectful but unblinking. A reporter spoke softly into her microphone, her voice describing closure, resolution, healing. But those words did not belong here. Closure was something tidy, something imagined by people untouched by grief. What the family felt was not closure, it was a new kind of emptiness, one that had shape and name now, but no comfort. The district attorney visited that evening, offering condolences and assuring them that justice would follow quickly. He spoke of sentencing, of procedure, of the law doing its part. Stephanie thanked him, though the words felt hollow. Justice could not bring back laughter echoing through the kitchen, or the late-night phone calls, or the smell of her sister's shampoo lingering in the hallway. The law could only end the story. It could not repair the heart. That night, the town gathered at the local church. Candles flickered across wooden pews, and the rain outside softened to mist. People held hands, some praying, some staring blankly at the floor. The pastor spoke about endurance, about how light returns even to the darkest valley. His words settled over the crowd like a fragile blanket. Stephanie sat near the front, her gaze fixed on the single candle placed beside her sister's framed photo. Its flame bent with every draft of air, but refused to go out. When the service ended, she walked outside alone. The streets glistened under the streetlights, each puddle reflecting pieces of the sky. She remembered the detective's warning that even when cases close, they never truly end. There are always memories that replay in the quiet hours, always questions that echo without answers. As she reached her car, the first drop of rain touched her cheek. It was colder than she expected, sharp and real. She looked up at the clouds and whispered that her sister could rest now. Somewhere far away, in a cell surrounded by gray walls, the man who had ended her life slept soundly, unaware that in this town, his name would forever be spoken only in anger. Weeks passed before the silence around the Wilberger family began to shift. Reporters moved on to other stories, the searchlights were packed away, and the rain washed the chalk markings from the sidewalks. The town wanted peace, but peace felt undeserved. For Stephanie, every quiet moment pressed against her chest like a weight. She found herself opening old drawers just to touch Brooke's handwriting, her notes, her grocery lists. The smallest traces of ordinary life had become sacred. The trial closed without ceremony. The man who had confessed was moved to a high-security prison, his sentence permanent, his future defined by concrete and metal. The family did not attend the final hearing. They did not need to see him again. Their focus had shifted toward healing, though healing was not the right word. Survival felt closer to the truth. Spring returned, soft and green. The town tried to breathe again, but the shadow of what had happened never truly lifted. One evening, while clearing old files at the police station, a detective came across another folder marked for review. It was a thin report, almost lost among the stacks, a case from across the ocean, different in setting, yet eerily familiar in tone. The heading read, Gielan Province, Missing Nurse. He opened it out of habit, expecting routine details. Instead, he found a story that mirrored the same anatomy of fear. A young woman, a quiet town, a vanishing that made no sense. The detective's hand tightened around the pages. For a moment, the hum of the station faded, replaced by the echo of rain against windows. He knew this file would not belong to Oregon, but it belonged to the same kind of darkness. Half a world away, in a hospital that smelled of antiseptic and cigarette smoke, a nurse named Li Fongping finished her shift. The corridor lights flickered, and the night air carried the sound of distant thunder. She had debts she could not pay, a boyfriend who avoided her calls, and a supervisor who watched her too closely. The clock above the nurse's station ticked slowly, each second stretching thin. She packed her bag and walked through the hospital's side door into an alley slick with rain. The city glowed faintly beyond the mist, the neon signs trembling in puddles. She thought of her family, of promises she had broken, of the numbers that haunted her bills unpaid, money owed, luck that never came. When a car stopped beside her, she turned without fear. The man behind the wheel smiled, offering her a ride home. What happened next would become another file, another testimony, another story told in whispers long after the courtroom lights went dark. The detective in Oregon closed the folder, staring at the label one more time. The past had not ended, it had only moved. Somewhere else, another storm was forming, ready to break. The story now moves east, where the rain sounds different, thinner, more distant against glass. In the city of Gielan, beneath towers of gray apartments, a nurse named Li Fongping walked home after a shift that had stretched too long. The corridors of the hospital still clung to her, the scent of disinfectant, the faint ringing of heart monitors, the tired faces she left behind. She had chosen nursing because she wanted to help people, but the weight of debt had turned every day into quiet desperation. Her life had become a careful balance between duty and fear. She owed more money than she could count, borrowed from a man who smiled too easily and collected too harshly. Each pay envelope disappeared before she could spend it. The debt collector's voice followed her like a shadow, always polite, always patient, never forgetting. The pressure bent her spine until kindness itself became heavy to carry. That evening, she counted the bills on her kitchen table, her hands trembling. The total was not enough. She stared at the small clock above the stove and whispered that she needed a miracle. The room stayed silent. Outside, thunder rumbled softly, as if answering in warning. The next day, at the hospital, a senior doctor noticed her worry. He was well respected, known for his calm, for his expensive suits and perfect manners. His name was Luo Bang. When he asked if she was all right, she smiled because saying no would have felt dangerous. Over the next few days, he continued to notice her, offering rides home, coffee during late shifts, advice about her finances. His tone was kind, but something in his eyes suggested calculation. She tried to believe his kindness was real. When he offered to help settle her debt, she hesitated only once before agreeing. He handed her an envelope and told her not to worry. Gratitude made her dizzy. That night, she slept for the first time in weeks. But relief turned quickly into something darker. The doctor began calling at strange hours, inviting her to dinner, then insisting. His compliments turned to suggestions, his tone soft but laced with control. When she resisted, he reminded her of the money she owed him now. The gift had become a chain. Days stretched into weeks, and the pressure returned, heavier than before. Her laughter faded. Her coworkers noticed the hollow look in her eyes. Rumors spread through the ward, quiet and cruel. She withdrew into herself, her voice barely audible, her movements automatic. Each shift ended the same, her walking through the rain, clutching her bag, staring at her reflection in shop windows as if looking for the woman she had been before. One night, she found another envelope on her doorstep, unmarked but familiar. Inside were photographs, grainy but unmistakable her, with the doctor, smiling under fluorescent light. A note was clipped to the top. "You belong to me now." The wind outside rose, rattling the windows. Somewhere above, thunder cracked again. She sat on the floor, the photos scattered around her, and whispered that she would not let him own her. But even as she said it, she felt how easily desperation can turn into something far more dangerous. In that small apartment, Li Fangping made a decision that would change not only her life, but the lives of everyone who would later read her name in a police report. Rain fell without pause, thin sheets sliding down concrete walls and pooling at the curbs. Inside her apartment, Li Fangping sat at the table surrounded by silence. The clock ticked without mercy, reminding her that morning would come soon, bringing another shift she could barely face. The envelope still lay open, the photographs inside curling at the edges. She stared at them until her eyes blurred, the faces blending into something shapeless and cruel. The doctor's words echoed through her mind. He had promised protection, then twisted it into ownership. His voice had grown sharper with every message, each one reminding her that debt was not just numbers, it was control. He knew where she lived, what time she left for work, who her friends were. He spoke as if he had built her life himself and could unmake it whenever he wished. At the hospital, his tone remained calm and public. He called her Miss Lee in front of others, his smile the picture of respect. But when no one was watching, his hand brushed her shoulder too long. His whispers followed her down sterile halls. She could not protest. Every word of defiance risked exposure, humiliation, or worse. The few coworkers who noticed pretended not to. In places built on hierarchy, silence becomes survival. One evening, he called her into his office after hours. The hallway lights flickered, casting long shadows on the tiled floor. He poured wine into 2 small glasses and told her that loyalty mattered more than gratitude. She did not drink. When she stood to leave, he blocked the door with his hand, smiling as though what came next was inevitable. She walked out minutes later with her uniform torn, her face blank. No one saw her tears until she reached the street. The next day, she came to work as if nothing had happened. She moved through her rounds with precision, greeting patients, checking vitals, writing notes. Only the small tremor in her hand betrayed her. Her co-workers whispered that she looked tired. The head nurse asked if she was ill. Li Fangping simply smiled and said she was fine. In a world that punishes honesty, lies can sound like grace. The harassment continued quietly, a poison she could not remove. The doctor followed her home again, left small gifts at her door, each one a reminder that he still owned her peace. The envelopes stopped carrying threats, they carried silence, which was worse. She knew he was waiting for her to break. Weeks later, a neighbor found her standing in the stairwell long after midnight, barefoot, staring out at the rain. When he asked if she was all right, she turned and smiled, saying only that she was counting the lights. The next morning, she returned to work as usual. That evening, she cleaned her apartment carefully, washed the dishes, folded her uniform, opened the windows to let the damp air in. She placed the photographs back into the envelope and sealed it shut. Her hands were steady now. She slipped the envelope into her bag and whispered to herself that she was done being afraid. When the rain thickened into a downpour, she put on her coat and walked toward the doctor's building. No one saw her enter. The security guard on duty remembered only the sound of the door closing softly behind her. Hours later, a neighbor reported hearing raised voices, then a crash, then silence. By morning, the city would wake to headlines that began with her name. The city woke beneath gray clouds and a low rumble of thunder that felt almost rehearsed. Inside the tall building where Dr. Luo lived, the hallway smelled faintly of wine and metal. The door to his apartment stood ajar. A neighbor, uneasy from the noise the night before, knocked once and waited. When no answer came, he pushed it open and froze. The scene was quiet, disturbingly orderly. A single lamp still glowed beside the couch. A half-filled glass of red wine had tipped, staining the carpet dark. The doctor sat in an armchair, his head tilted to one side, his shirt wrinkled and collar open. To anyone entering quickly, it might have looked like sleep. Only the unnatural stillness revealed the truth. On the table beside him lay an envelope marked in careful handwriting, his name written once, clean and deliberate. By the time police arrived, rain had washed the street clean of footprints. Officers moved through the apartment in practiced silence. They found no sign of forced entry, no struggle beyond a few overturned papers. A second glass bore fingerprints that matched Li Fangping. At the hospital, her co-workers whispered long before the news confirmed it. She had not come to work that morning. Her locker was empty except for a folded uniform and a name tag placed neatly on top. The head nurse sat in her office with trembling hands, unable to reconcile the woman she knew with what she was hearing. Detectives found Li Fangping later that afternoon in a small riverside park. She was sitting on a bench, her coat soaked through, staring at the water as if it were a mirror. When they approached, she did not run. She looked at them calmly and said, "I didn't mean to," but he wouldn't stop. Her voice was almost gentle. At the station, she spoke little. Her statement was brief. A meeting, a final argument, a flash of fear followed by something colder. She said he had reached for her again, and she had reacted without thinking. When she realized what had happened, she wiped her hands, wrote his name on the envelope, and left. No one could tell if her calmness came from shock or relief. The investigation confirmed her account, but that did not ease the headlines. The story spread fast, the public torn between pity and condemnation. Some called her a victim pushed too far, others a murderer hiding behind sympathy. The court would later call it a crime of impulse, born from humiliation and despair. Her parents arrived from their village days later, their faces gray from grief and shame. They sat behind her during the hearing, unable to meet her eyes. When the sentence was read, the courtroom remained silent. She nodded once, whispered thank you, and was led away. Outside, rain fell again, thin and endless. A reporter described the verdict as tragic, the perfect word for something that offered no satisfaction. In the following weeks, the hospital replaced her, scrubbed her name from the roster, and carried on as if she had never existed. Only the head nurse left a small flower on her empty locker before it was cleared out. In the evenings, the river where she had been found glimmered beneath the city lights. The wind that passed over the water seemed to carry her words, still not confession, not remorse, but the echo of a woman who wanted to be free. The trial began under a curtain of steady rain that blurred the courthouse windows. The city seemed to hold its breath, drawn to the spectacle of a nurse-turned-killer, a story made for headlines. Every seat inside the courtroom filled before sunrise. Reporters lined the walls with notebooks ready, pens trembling with curiosity disguised as duty. Li Fangping sat at the defense table, wearing a pale sweater that made her look smaller, almost fragile. Her hair had grown uneven during detention, and her eyes no longer met the crowd's. The judge asked if she understood the charges. She nodded once. Her lawyer, a quiet man with tired hands, leaned close and whispered something no one else could hear. She nodded again. The prosecution painted a picture of cold calculation. They spoke of betrayal, of a trusted nurse who turned violence into vengeance. Photographs of the scene appeared on a screen, the tipped glass, the folded envelope, the doctor's lifeless form. They described poison in clinical terms, how it had worked through his body silently while he read the note she left. It was not quick. It was deliberate. The defense countered with a story the jury could feel years of coercion, humiliation, and fear. They spoke of the night she came to his door, not to harm but to beg for release, how the confrontation had spiraled when he refused to let her leave. They showed messages, voicemails, fragments of words that revealed a pattern of control. The lawyer's voice trembled when he said that sometimes justice fails so long that people start taking it back themselves. Throughout it all, Li Fangping remained still. She did not cry. When asked if she regretted what she had done, she whispered that she regretted being weak enough to allow it to happen for so long. The room fell silent. Even the prosecutor stopped writing. The verdict came after hours of deliberation. The charge was reduced not murder, but manslaughter under extreme distress. The sentence meant years behind bars, not death. When the judge read the decision, no one moved. Some in the crowd gasped, others nodded. A mother in the back row began to weep quietly, her sound echoing in the high ceiling like rain on glass. After the hearing, the lawyer thanked the jury in a low voice and placed a hand on his client's shoulder. She looked at him once, her expression unreadable, and said that she wished she could have found another way. As she was led from the room, flashes from cameras painted her face in bursts of white. Each flash captured a different version of her victim, villain, survivor. Outside, the courthouse steps filled with umbrellas. The crowd divided itself the way people always do when faced with tragedy, half demanding punishment, half whispering forgiveness. Reporters spoke of lessons learned, though none could name them. The head nurse from the hospital stood at the edge of the crowd, holding her own umbrella low. She whispered a short prayer, not for absolution, but for peace that might one day reach the woman who once walked those bright hospital corridors in white shoes and soft laughter. By nightfall, the rain had washed away the chalk marks from the courthouse pavement. The story that had consumed the city began to fade from front pages, replaced by newer tragedies. Yet somewhere behind prison walls, Li Fangping sat near a window, listening to the storm, and for the first time in months, she smiled. The silence that followed was her own. When the verdict reached the public, the city fractured. In cafes and narrow alleys, people argued about justice and mercy, as if either could rewrite the past. Some said the sentence was too light, that a life lost should weigh heavier. Others whispered that prison was punishment enough for a woman who had already spent her years chained by fear. Every opinion carried the same bitterness, a hunger for meaning in something that made none. Inside the detention center, the days fell into a quiet rhythm. Li Fangping rose early, folded her blanket, and stood for inspection. The walls smelled of bleach and thyme. Her cellmate, an older woman who rarely spoke, offered her tea made from crushed herbs smuggled from the kitchen. They shared it in silence. The world outside had stopped caring about her story. Inside, silence was its own kind of forgiveness. Each week, she received a letter from her parents. They never mentioned the trial, only the weather, the crops, and the family dog that still waited by the gate. Her mother's handwriting trembled, the ink often blurred by tears. Li Fangping read each letter slowly, then folded it with care, keeping them in a neat stack beneath her pillow. Reporters tried to keep the story alive, but the audience had already moved on. New scandals, new tragedies, new faces filled the evening news. The nurse who once shocked the nation became a cautionary footnote in a documentary about desperation. Her name faded from the headlines, but stayed alive in whispers, a ghost passed between gossip and sympathy. In the courtroom where she had once sat, another case took her place, another story of anger turned inward. The judge, the same one who sentenced her, paused for a moment before calling the next name. Some cases never truly end, they simply hand their echoes to the next. In the small apartment where she once lived, her former neighbor still remembered the night of the storm. He sometimes stood in the hallway, staring at the door that had stayed locked since her arrest. He claimed that on quiet nights, when rain pressed against the windows, he could still hear her footsteps, slow, measured, and final. Years passed quietly. Inside the prison, Li Fangping became a model inmate, assisting in the infirmary, tending to patients with the same gentle precision she once offered in the hospital. The guards began to trust her. They said she never raised her voice, never argued, never asked for more than she was given. Some thought her calmness a sign of peace. Others saw it as something colder, acceptance. One evening, a new inmate recognized her name and whispered the story to others, painting her as both victim and villain. When one woman asked if it was true, Li Fangping simply replied, "People believe what helps them sleep." Then she returned to her work, her hands steady, her face unreadable. Outside, in the wider world, her sentence became part of a statistic, another case filed under temporary madness, another example used in debates about power and gender. But in her own mind, the labels no longer mattered. She had taken back what had been stolen, though the cost had been her freedom. On the day the rains returned, She stood by the window of the infirmary and watched the sky darken. The rhythm against the glass reminded her of the night everything had changed. She closed her eyes, letting the sound fill her. The past no longer frightened her. It simply existed, quiet and unmovable. Somewhere beyond the gray horizon, a different storm was forming, waiting to open another file, another tragedy. But for this moment, the world around her held still, caught between punishment and peace. The next file arrived with a soft click in the archive room, the paper still smelling faintly of dust and iron. The detective who opened it had seen too many stories end the same way, yet this one caught his eye for its simplicity. 3 names, 1 building, and a single word scrawled across the cover: elevator. He turned the first page and began to read. The case came from Hong Kong, the early years of economic bloom when neon light painted every window and narrow streets echoed with the hum of machinery. The city was alive, crowded and relentless, its people moving upward toward new hopes and new dangers. Beneath that gleaming promise, however, were towers of concrete where dreams could turn claustrophobic. In one such building lived Ho Ran, a soft-spoken man in his late 20s who repaired air conditioners for a living. His best friend, A. Jen, worked at a hardware shop downstairs. The two shared dinners, laughter, and a routine born from years of friendship. They met each morning in the lobby before taking the same elevator to work. That small square of metal and mirrored walls had become part of their lives, a ritual of comfort. Ho Ran also shared the building with a woman named Mei Ling, who lived 2 floors above. She often greeted them in the hallway, polite but distant. To a Jen, she was simply a neighbor. To Ho Ran, she became something else, a quiet fascination that grew each day. He began timing his departures to match hers, carrying small gifts he never found the courage to give. The obsession deepened slowly, disguised as affection. He began recording her comings and goings, memorizing the sound of her shoes on the stairs. His apartment filled with notes and sketches, a private map of someone who barely knew his name. When Mei Ling announced that she was leaving the building to move closer to her new fiancé, something in Ho Ran's mind began to crack. He stopped sleeping, stopped eating, and started visiting the small temple at the edge of the district. The priest there remembered him quiet, trembling, asking if love could ever turn into sin. The priest told him that love becomes sin when it forgets respect. Ho Ran left without speaking again. The following week, Mei Ling stepped into the elevator as usual, pressing the button for the ground floor. Moments later, the power flickered. The building plunged into half-darkness. A maintenance worker heard a scream that stopped as quickly as it began. When the lights returned, the elevator doors opened to reveal chaos that words could not fully describe. The newspapers called it the elevator murder, a name that would haunt the city for years. The details were disturbing, but clinical. A weapon found on the floor, fingerprints identified, a suspect missing. Police traced the trail back to Ho Ran's apartment, where they found his tools, a notebook filled with prayers, and a single sentence written across the final page: "If love cannot rise, it must descend." The detective reading the file exhaled slowly, his fingers resting on the page. He had seen how obsession masquerades as devotion, how loneliness can twist itself into violence. The file was thin, yet heavy enough to remind him that darkness often hides in the smallest spaces, sometimes no larger than an elevator car. Outside, rain began to fall against the windows of the archive, the same rhythm that seemed to tie every case together. Another story had opened, and somewhere in that city of glass and shadow, a friend named Jen was about to wake into a nightmare that would define the rest of his life. The morning after the murder, The air inside the building felt heavy, as if grief itself had settled into the walls. Police sealed the lobby, blocking the elevator with yellow tape. Residents whispered in the stairwell, their voices shaking. A Jen stood outside the entrance, staring at the flashing lights, unable to believe that the machine he rode every day had become a tomb. He answered questions through the blur of shock. He told the officers about his friend, about their routines, about the woman who smiled politely when they met. When they asked if he knew where Horan was, he said no, though the denial came too quickly. Deep inside, something told him that his friend's silence was more than fear. It was guilt. Detectives searched Horan's apartment that afternoon. The smell of incense mixed with something metallic and old. On the walls hung dozens of photographs, some of elevators, some of Mei Ling. Her image appeared again and again, as if she had lived her whole life in his lens. In the kitchen sink lay a tool streaked with rust, its handle wrapped in cloth. The officer who found it said nothing. He simply covered it with a plastic sheet and wrote the evidence tag. Ajahn watched from the hallway, his hands trembling. He remembered the last conversation they had shared only days earlier, a quiet evening on the rooftop when Horan spoke about loneliness as if it were a living thing. He had said that love should not hurt, but sometimes it needs to. At the time, Ajahn thought it was poetry. Now it sounded like prophecy. By nightfall, police had issued a warrant. Horan had vanished into the sprawl of the city, leaving behind only the fragments of a life unraveling. The search spread to hotels, train stations, and ferry ports. Each time a tip arrived, officers followed, only to find dead ends and blurred faces on cameras. It was as if the city itself had swallowed him. Ajahn could not sleep. Every sound in the hallway made him flinch. He replayed their friendship over and over: the dinners, the laughter, the shared cigarettes after work. How had he missed the signs? The thought of betrayal twisted his stomach. Guilt and anger blurred until they felt like the same emotion. Days later, police found Horan hiding in an abandoned factory on the edge of the district. He was unarmed, sitting on the floor with his back against a wall, humming softly. When officers entered, he lifted his head and said, "She's not gone. She's just waiting between floors." The words chilled them, a sentence spoken by someone whose mind had already fallen beyond reason. In custody, he confessed without resistance. He spoke of jealousy, of love misunderstood, of divine punishment. He said the moment the lights flickered, he felt God testing his faith. His voice stayed calm, his eyes clear. The psychiatrist later described it as a delusional trance, a belief that his act had elevated her spirit to something pure. The news spread across the city like fire. People filled the streets outside the courthouse, shouting for punishment. The building owner ordered the elevator removed, its shaft sealed with concrete. Yet, no matter how many repairs followed, residents claimed they could still hear faint music between the second and third floors, a tune no one recognized but everyone feared. Ajahn moved away soon after. He told reporters that friendship, once lost, becomes the loudest kind of ghost. He never entered another elevator alone. Even years later, whenever the lights flickered, he still saw his friend's face, not cruel, not angry, but lost, reaching for something he could never hold again. The courtroom was packed before dawn, bodies pressed together in the thick summer air. Outside, the city pulsed with noise, but inside there was only the whisper of paper and the distant hum of ceiling fans. Horan sat at the center of it all, pale and motionless, his hands folded on the table like a man attending a sermon. The guards flanked him, their expressions unreadable. The judge entered, and the room rose to its feet. Ho-Ran did not look up. His lawyer had urged him to show remorse, but there was nothing in his face to suggest sorrow or pride. When asked to confirm his confession, he simply said yes. His voice was clear, his tone calm, as though he were reciting instructions instead of describing the end of a life. The prosecution began with photographs, the elevator doors, the scattered belongings, the instrument left behind. Each image drew quiet gasps from the spectators. They spoke of jealousy turned divine obsession, of a man who mistook control for devotion. When they quoted his final words from the confession, "If love cannot rise, it must descend," a chill moved through the room. The defense tried to paint him as a man unwell, consumed by voices and religious delusion. They brought doctors who described hallucinations, fractured reasoning, the slow unraveling of a mind shaped by loneliness. But the city was not in the mood for mercy. Every headline called him monster, madman, ghost. Outside the courthouse, protesters held signs demanding execution. Through it all, Ho-Ran remained silent. When the psychiatrist asked what he remembered of that night, he said he remembered light flickering, a sudden peace, and the sound of the elevator bell. He said he had done what love required to keep her close forever. The courtroom froze. No one dared to breathe. The judge asked if he understood what love truly meant. Ho-Ran smiled faintly and replied, "It means not letting go." Ajahn testified near the end. His voice broke only once, when describing their friendship before everything fell apart. He said he wanted to hate him, but hate had nowhere to go. It kept turning into grief. When he stepped down from the stand, he avoided Ho-Ran's eyes, afraid of what he might still recognize there. The verdict came swiftly. The court declared him guilty, the punishment severe. The judge's words were firm but sorrowful, that some crimes are not born of evil, but of madness left to grow unchecked. Ho-Ran bowed his head slightly, as if acknowledging a truth he had known all along. In the days that followed, the story consumed the city. The elevator where it happened was sealed and blessed by monks. Yet rumors began to spread about a strange hum at night, about flickering lights that moved on their own between floors. Some said it was only faulty wiring. Others said love leaves echoes when it dies violently. Ajahn left Hong Kong soon after, taking a job far from the city. On his last night there, he passed by the old building. Rain slicked the pavement, and the air smelled of metal. For a moment, he thought he heard the elevator bell, one single chime in an empty corridor. He turned quickly, but the doors stayed closed. He whispered his friend's name once, softly, and walked away. The rain swallowed the sound, leaving only the memory of a friendship that had turned to legend, a warning told to anyone who mistook obsession for devotion. Months passed before the city exhaled. The court transcripts were sealed, the headlines faded, and the old building stood empty for repairs that never truly ended. Yet the story refused to rest. Every rumor grew a new shape, whispered from one street to another about shadows in the elevator shaft, about music playing faintly when no one was there. Some said it was guilt haunting the city. Others said it was memory refusing to die. The new tenants who moved in claimed they could feel a chill each time they crossed the lobby. The elevator, though repaired, seemed alive in its silence. On certain nights, the doors would open on their own and close without reason. Children refused to ride it alone. Old residents crossed themselves before stepping inside. The building supervisor called technicians again and again, but every inspection ended the same way: no fault found. Only a low hum that faded when they listened closely. Ajahn's name reappeared once in the news, when he sent a short letter to the families of the victims, apologizing for not seeing the truth sooner. He wrote that friendship can blind as easily as it heals. The letter ended with one sentence: he wanted to rise, but he only knew how to fall. After that, he vanished from public record. The city itself changed. Laws tightened around psychological evaluations for workers in high-stress professions. Hospitals began offering counseling for those who lived alone. For a time, people felt safer, but in every bright apartment tower, when the lights flickered or the power hesitated, someone always remembered the story. At the small temple Horan once visited, the priest kept his photo locked in a drawer. Sometimes, before the evening prayers, he took it out and looked at it, a reminder of how fragile the mind can be when love turns inward. He told visitors that mercy and fear are closer than they think. The donation box near the altar overflowed that year, as if people believed money could buy protection from their own shadows. The elevator itself became a symbol. Tourists asked to see it, reporters filmed documentaries, and online forums argued over details the official records left out. Each retelling twisted the truth a little more until the story lived half in fact, half in folklore. It became something parents told their children, a caution about desire, about obsession, about what happens when loneliness finds no light to follow. One evening, during a late inspection, a maintenance worker stayed behind after everyone left. He claimed he heard a faint humming between floors, the same tune witnesses had mentioned years earlier. When he leaned close to the control panel, the melody stopped, replaced by a single whisper in a voice that sounded human yet hollow. He left his tools behind and never returned to that building again. By the next morning, the rumor had already spread. The elevator was sealed once more, this time for good. The residents used the stairs, grateful for the exercise, unwilling to speak about what they had heard. The city moved on, pretending to forget, but every rainfall seemed to echo that one word scrawled across the police file: elevator. And so the story slipped into the archives, resting quietly among others, a chronicle of love, madness, and the small spaces where they meet. The detective who first reopened the case closed the folder and stared out the window, watching rain trace lines down the glass. Another file waited beside his hand, marked with a different name, a different country, a different storm. The harbor lights of Hong Kong shone like fragments of glass scattered across dark water. Cargo horns groaned in the distance while ferries moved between islands, leaving ribbons of foam that glowed under the moon. Among the crowd waiting to board one of those ferries stood Jen, a single suitcase at his feet, the weight of years pressing against his shoulders. He had sold what little he owned, left his job at the hardware shop, and given notice to his landlord. There was nothing left to tie him to the building that had once been his home. Still, when the announcement called for passengers, he hesitated. Behind him, the skyline flickered in humid air. Somewhere up there, among towers of glass and concrete, the elevator waited in silence. He had not returned since the trial, yet the memories clung to him like dust. He saw Ho Ran's smile in strangers, heard his laugh in the echo of the train station. The thought of his friend's hands, once steady, once kind turning violent, still kept him awake. The question that haunted him most was not why it happened, but whether he could have stopped it. Friendship, he realized, is a fragile kind of faith. Once it breaks, it cuts both ways. As the ferry began to move, the wind carried the faint smell of rain. He closed his eyes, letting the rhythm of the water settle into his chest. Across the bay, thunder rolled over the hills, soft but insistent. It reminded him of that night when lights flickered and the city seemed to hold its breath. He imagined the elevator sealed behind concrete, but in his mind the doors still opened, revealing not horror but emptiness, a space too small for forgiveness, yet too large for forgetting. In the months that followed, A-Gen built a new life on another shore. He rented a single room above a noodle shop, worked quietly, spoke little. The people there knew him as gentle, punctual, polite. They did not ask about his past, and he offered nothing. At night, he walked along the waterfront, watching ships vanish into fog. The sea's breathing became his prayer, its endless motion a comfort. Sometimes, on evenings heavy with rain, he caught himself turning toward reflections in puddles, half expecting to see his friend standing beside him. The shadow never appeared, but the feeling lingered, a mix of guilt and compassion that refused to fade. He learned to live with it, the way people live with scars. Years later, a letter reached him from an old neighbor. The building where everything happened had been torn down. The elevator shaft, once sealed, was gone. A-Gen read the letter twice, folded it neatly, and placed it under a cup of tea. He stared at the steam curling upward, whispering that maybe now the city could sleep. Yet deep inside, he knew stories like theirs never really end. They sink into the foundations, waiting for another heart to echo them. That night, he dreamed of the harbor again. In the dream, the ferry lights flickered, and someone called his name from the opposite shore, a voice calm, familiar, almost kind. He stepped forward, but before he could see who it was, the sound dissolved into rain. He woke with tears on his face, and the faintest sense that forgiveness, like dawn, always arrives one moment too late. Outside, the rain began again, tapping softly against the shutters. Somewhere beyond that quiet rhythm, another story was already forming, one of sorrow turning to suspense, ready to unfold beneath a different sky. The detective turned another page in the dim archive room, his lamp buzzing softly as the storm outside pushed against the windows. The previous case had closed in sorrow, but the next file began with unease. The label read East Java Ryan Jombang. Below it, a single phrase typed in fading ink: faith, charm, deception. He exhaled slowly, knowing before he began that faith and violence too often shared the same stage. The story opened in a small town on the edge of the Indonesian countryside. There, beneath endless skies and roads lined with banana trees, a young preacher named Ryan lived a double life. By day he taught scripture, smiling for the cameras of his growing congregation. By night, whispers followed him through alleys where the faithful dared not walk. He dressed in white robes, carried himself with calm authority, and spoke of redemption with a voice that could melt stone. People trusted him because he seemed certain of everything. He had been born into poverty, raised in a house of strict beliefs and quiet cruelty. His father, a man of iron discipline, taught him that control was love and obedience was salvation. By the time he reached adulthood, Ryan had learned to mimic gentleness while hiding resentment like a blade beneath his tongue. The church gave him power, the pulpit gave him theater. As the years passed, he drew more followers, mostly young men seeking direction and women searching for meaning. They called him teacher, prophet, sometimes saint. He collected donations for charity projects that never existed. He told stories of healing that no one could confirm. Yet his words were magnetic, and the town wanted to believe. One evening, a student disappeared after a private session with him. Her family asked questions, but the preacher's influence silenced suspicion. He comforted them with verses about faith and loss, even visiting their home to lead prayer. His voice trembled with compassion, his hands warm against their shoulders. No one imagined that beneath his calm expression, panic was beginning to bloom. The missing girl became a rumor, then a memory. Years later, another follower vanished, this time a young man. Again, no proof. Again, Ryan wept in front of cameras, promising divine justice. The town continued to believe. Yet some neighbors began to notice things: the way he avoided questions about his travels, the heavy boxes carried into his yard late at night, the faint smell of earth after rain that lingered around his property. Behind his house stood a small garden surrounded by high walls. Inside it, the soil was freshly turned, though nothing seemed to grow. The local children said they heard strange sounds there after dark, a rhythm like digging, sometimes laughter, sometimes prayer. Adults dismissed it as fear. But one boy, curious beyond wisdom, climbed the wall one evening and saw something that made him run until his breath broke. He told his parents what he had seen: holes, many of them covered with loose soil. The police arrived the next morning. The preacher smiled as they searched, his calm unbroken, his voice gentle as he recited scripture about patience and misunderstanding. Yet when they reached the back of the garden, the ground gave way beneath a shovel. The first discovery silenced everyone. What they found would turn faith into horror, devotion into disbelief. The man once called prophet would soon become a symbol of something far darker, the mask of righteousness hiding the face of ruin. Outside the archive room, the detective closed the file halfway, rubbing his eyes. He had read enough to know that some monsters do not hide in the shadows. They stand behind pulpits, smiling as they bless the crowd. The story of Ryan Jombang began long before the crimes, long before the followers and the television sermons. It began in a narrow house at the end of a dirt road, where discipline was a daily ritual. His father, a preacher of small means but endless certainty, ruled the home with scripture and silence. His mother obeyed both husband and faith with a devotion that looked like fear. From the moment Ryan could speak, he learned that love was earned only through obedience, and pain was proof of divine attention. As a child, he craved approval the way other children craved sweets. Each mistake brought punishment, each act of perfection earned only quiet nods. When he cried, his father quoted verses about humility. When he questioned, he was told doubt was sin. At night, lying on a thin mattress, he would stare at the cracked ceiling and imagine himself preaching to a crowd that loved him, not for obedience, but for words. Even then, he rehearsed power. He was bright, charming, and quick to read the moods of others. Teachers said he had a gift for persuasion. Classmates said he scared them because he smiled too easily, especially when people cried. He spoke softly, but every word seemed weighted with hidden meaning. As he grew older, that calm voice became his armor. He could silence anger with gentleness and turn suspicion into sympathy. When he left home, he carried both his father's Bible and his cruelty. In the city, he studied theology while working odd jobs. He learned how to blend charisma with scripture, how to speak about forgiveness while hiding manipulation beneath every blessing. It was there that he discovered the secret power of suffering, how people, when broken enough, would follow anyone who promised to make them whole. The first congregation that took him in was small, built on faith and exhaustion. The members were farmers and laborers, people too tired to ask questions. Ryan arrived with a smile and a voice that made old hymns sound new. Within weeks, attendance doubled. Within months, donations tripled. He wore humility like a costume, always thanking God for the gifts he quietly pocketed. When his father died, he returned home briefly for the funeral. Neighbors remembered his eulogy, passionate, tearless, and perfectly rehearsed. He spoke about legacy, about carrying the torch of faith into a darker world. His mother sat in the front row, eyes hollow, hands folded tight. She would later tell relatives that something in her son's eyes that day frightened her more than his father's anger ever had. Back in the city, Ryan expanded his ministry. He learned to use charm like a tool, promising salvation in exchange for loyalty. The line between devotion and submission blurred quickly. He began demanding private meetings with followers, framing them as spiritual guidance sessions. Some left uneasy but stayed silent. Others stayed, mistaking control for care. Behind closed doors, his tone changed. The preacher's warmth turned cold, his words sharp. He used confession as a weapon, twisting people's fears into obedience. The ones who resisted were humiliated publicly, their sins declared from the pulpit under the guise of deliverance. By the time whispers of abuse began to circulate, his reputation had grown too large to question. The local authorities admired his charity work. The newspapers called him a beacon of modern faith. To the public, he was untouchable. To those who knew him privately, he was a storm that smiled. Yet inside him, something darker was taking shape, a resentment that years of praise could not soothe. He had built a world where everyone bowed, yet he still felt the small boy in the dirt road house, unseen and unloved. That hunger would soon drive him beyond control, into acts that no scripture could ever justify. The first disappearance was not planned. The second was. And by the third, Ryan Jombang no longer saw his victims as people, only as confessions he could bury. The first clue surfaced on a humid afternoon when the smell of decay drifted through the preacher's garden. Neighbors had grown used to strange noises at night, shovels striking earth, whispered prayers, sometimes laughter, but the scent was new, sharp enough to pull attention from even the most faithful. A woman hanging laundry nearby was the first to mention it, her voice low, as though naming it might summon misfortune. When officers arrived, Ryan greeted them with his usual calm smile. He wore a crisp white shirt and greeted each man by name, thanking them for their service. He spoke gently, his tone so steady that the neighbors began to doubt their own unease. The police walked through the house, noting its orderliness, the framed scripture on every wall, the spotless kitchen counters. Yet behind the preacher's charm lay something heavier, an undercurrent of control, a precision that felt unnatural. In the garden, the soil was dark and damp, turned recently. Ryan explained that he was preparing to plant new trees for the community. The officers nodded but marked the area for later examination. One of them, a veteran investigator, noticed the faint outline of a wooden plank near the base of a tree. When he pressed his boot against it, the ground shifted slightly. The movement was small, but it was enough. They returned with a warrant the next morning. Ryan welcomed them again, offering tea as if hosting honored guests. When they refused, he simply smiled and quoted a verse about patience. But the smile faded when they began to dig. Within minutes, the shovel struck something that should not have been there. Fabric, pale and stained, hidden beneath layers of earth. The first discovery silenced everyone. The police stepped back. The veteran officer removed his hat. The neighbors watching from behind the fence crossed themselves and began to whisper prayers. Ryan stood still, eyes fixed on the hole as though seeing it for the first time. Then he said softly, "I warned them to repent." His voice carried neither panic nor remorse, only conviction. By dusk, the garden had become a crime scene. Lanterns cast harsh light across the ground as officers unearthed what they believed were multiple graves. The air filled with a mixture of soil, rain, and something ancient, the scent of betrayal wrapped in faith. Ryan was led away in handcuffs, still reciting scripture. To those watching, he looked less like a criminal than a man certain of his own righteousness. Word spread through the town before sunrise. Crowds gathered at the gates of his church, tearing down the banners that once bore his image. Some wept, others shouted. The faithful burned his sermons in the street, pages curling into black ash that floated into the morning sky. The building, once a place of worship, now felt cursed. Investigators found evidence of meticulous planning journals filled with names, dates, and confessions written in Ryan's hand. Each entry ended with the same phrase, "saved through silence." The words appeared again and again, ink pressed deep into the paper as if carved. In the following days, families came forward, connecting old disappearances to his name. Mothers clutched faded photographs. Fathers spoke of children who had gone missing after attending his lessons. The town that once called him saint now spat his name like poison. Inside his cell, Ryan remained composed. He told the guards he had done nothing wrong, that his victims were chosen by divine instruction. When asked about the graves, he said they were resting places for souls too fragile for the world. His eyes shone with something beyond madness, the peace of a man convinced that evil was holy. As night fell, the police covered the final grave and marked the garden as evidence. Rain began again, turning the soil to mud. The lights reflected off puddles that mirrored the sky, making it impossible to tell where heaven ended and the earth began. And in the silence between thunderclaps, the town listened to the sound of shovels, to the echo of prayers, to the truth that faith, in the wrong hands, can dig its own grave. Morning broke pale and heavy, clouds hanging low over the preacher's house. The garden that had once hosted sermons and community gatherings was now a grid of shallow pits marked by wooden stakes and numbered tags. Police tents rippled in the damp wind. The sound of digging mixed with the clicking of cameras and the low murmurs of officers who had seen too much. Each shovelful of earth brought up fragments of a hidden world jewelry, scraps of clothing, personal belongings that turned the garden into a timeline of faith betrayed. The forensic team moved methodically, recording every discovery while trying not to meet one another's eyes. Reporters gathered behind the fence, their voices subdued for once, as if the air itself demanded reverence. Ryan watched from the police vehicle parked nearby. His wrists were bound, but his posture remained regal, almost serene. He asked one of the officers whether the rain had stopped. When told it hadn't, he smiled faintly and said, "Then the cleansing continues." No one answered. By midday, the number of unearthed graves had risen beyond what anyone expected. Each one revealed another layer of deception. The victims came from different towns, some missing for years, others whose families had long given up hope. The forensic reports told a quiet story of fear and final prayers. The press soon called it the Garden of Silence. Inside the interrogation room, Ryan sat across from the lead detective. The walls were bare, except for a single clock that ticked too loudly. The detective asked why he had done it. Ryan replied with scripture, quoting verses about redemption through suffering. His tone never changed, his breathing steady. When pressed further, he leaned forward, his eyes bright. "They wanted peace," he said softly. "I gave it to them." The detective pushed a photograph across the table, the first victim, a young woman whose face still carried the innocence of trust. Ryan studied it for a long moment, then nodded. "She confessed her sins to me," he said. "I helped her ascend." The detective's hand tightened around his pen. For hours, they went back and forth, the detective trying to break the wall of delusion, Ryan weaving words that turned morality inside out. He spoke of visions, of angels commanding him to cleanse corruption, of voices that whispered only when he prayed alone at night. The psychiatrist, observing through the glass, scribbled a note. Pathological conviction. Believes himself chosen. When shown the evidence, the journals, the fingerprints, the recovered belongings, Ryan's calm faltered for the first time. He looked at the photographs spread before him and said quietly, "They shouldn't have doubted me." Then he closed his eyes and began reciting prayers under his breath until his voice cracked into laughter. Outside the station, the crowd thickened. Families of the victims held candles, their faces pale with disbelief. Some shouted his name, demanding justice. Others simply stood in silence, staring at the building that now held the man who had taken everything from them. The air smelled of wax and rain. That evening, the detective returned to his desk, his clothes still damp from the storm. He opened Ryan's final notebook, the one found beneath his bed. The pages were filled with meticulous handwriting, each line beginning with a prayer and ending with a name. The last entry read, "When they stop believing, I will dig again." The detective closed the book, his throat dry. Outside, thunder rolled over the valley, deep and endless. He realized the preacher's faith had never been broken. It had only rotted from within, spreading like roots through the soil he had tended so carefully. The next morning, Ryan was transferred to a high-security prison. As he stepped out of the van, he looked up at the gray sky and whispered, "You cannot bury truth." The guard beside him muttered that some truths should stay buried. Neither man spoke again. And somewhere behind the prison walls, the echo of those words would linger not as prophecy, but as warning. The trial opened beneath a storm that would not leave the sky. People traveled from distant towns just to see the man who had once promised them heaven now walk in chains. The courthouse was packed long before dawn, the air inside thick with sweat and disbelief. Outside, vendors sold tea to the waiting crowd as if tragedy had become entertainment. The police struggled to hold the line as reporters shouted for statements, their microphones trembling in the rain. Ryan Jombang entered the courtroom, dressed in a plain white shirt, the same color he had worn in every sermon. His wrists were bound, yet he moved with the calm grace of a man attending his own service. When he sat, he bowed his head as though praying. The judge called for silence, but the room stayed restless. It was not curiosity that filled the air anymore. It was outrage mixed with shame that faith had blinded them for so long. The prosecution laid out its case in heavy detail. Photographs from the garden flashed across the screen. Each image met with gasps. The list of names read like a prayer gone wrong, one that stretched through years and tears. The prosecutor's voice broke only once, when describing how families had waited by telephones that never rang, praying to the very man who had stolen their children. Ryan listened without reaction. When the judge asked if he wished to speak, he rose slowly, his eyes calm. He began quoting scripture again, twisting verses into riddles of justification. He called himself a shepherd, misunderstood by his flock. His words filled the room with a cold kind of poetry that made some in the audience shiver. The judge cut him off, demanding plain truth. Ryan smiled and said, "Truth is what you bury when you cannot face it." Psychiatrists testified about delusion and grandiosity. They described a man who had built a religion of one, where his voice replaced the divine. The defense leaned heavily on insanity, painting him as a victim of his own faith. Yet each time Ryan spoke, his clarity betrayed the claim. He was too precise, too aware, too proud. His madness, they realized, was selective, not confusion, but belief sharpened into cruelty. In the crowd sat, mothers clutching framed photos, fathers with hands clenched into silence. One woman fainted when the prosecution read a letter Ryan had written to a victim's family, claiming their loss was God's will fulfilled. The courtroom descended into chaos until guards forced order back into place. Even the judge's gavel sounded tired. After weeks of testimony, the verdict came down hard. Guilty on every count, life imprisonment without parole. The words echoed across the room, bouncing off walls that had heard too many verdicts to feel satisfaction. Ryan closed his eyes, nodded once, and whispered, "I accept my mission." The crowd erupted, some cheering, others crying, none feeling truly vindicated. Outside, rain poured again, washing the courthouse steps as if the sky itself sought to cleanse what had been said within. Reporters asked the same question to anyone who would answer. How had he fooled them all for so long? The answers varied: charisma, faith, desperation, but none satisfied the weight of collective guilt. In prison, Ryan refused legal appeals. He asked only for paper and a pen. Guards found him writing sermons late into the night, the pages filled with words about redemption and rebirth. They confiscated them after discovering hidden lines that sounded like coded messages to anyone still willing to listen. Even behind bars, his voice carried beyond the walls. The government faced outrage. Officials who once praised his community work now scrambled to distance themselves. Investigations began into how so many complaints had been dismissed, how reports had vanished. The country's faith institutions called for reform, though everyone knew reforms rarely reach the places that need them most. When the detective who arrested him visited the prison months later, Ryan greeted him with the same serene smile. "You found the graves," he said softly, "but not the root." The detective stared at him for a long time, realizing he was right in a way that offered no comfort. Evil, like faith, grows where people stop looking. That night, the detective wrote his report, ending it with one sentence that would never reach the newspapers. A nation can forgive sin, but it must never forget the silence that allowed it. Outside, the rain slowed to a whisper, and somewhere in the dark, another case waited for its turn to be opened. The rain over Indonesia faded into memory as the detective turned the next folder in the archive. The cover was stamped in blue ink and written in a neat European hand, Patras Greece Rula Paspigu. Beneath it, a single line in the notes section, "Children lost under one roof." He hesitated before opening it. He had read enough cases to know that when tragedy hides in a home, it leaves the deepest scars. The story began on a quiet street near the sea, where sunlight painted the walls white and the scent of salt clung to the air. The Paspigu family was well known: a young mother, her husband, and 3 daughters who played in the garden every afternoon. Neighbors described laughter echoing through open windows, a family so ordinary it almost seemed charmed. But beneath that warmth, the foundation was already cracking. Rula, the mother, had grown up craving attention. She was beautiful, meticulous, and proud of the image she presented. Social media had become her mirror, every post polished, every smile rehearsed. Her husband, Manos, worked long hours at the port. Their marriage, though polite in public, was strained behind closed doors. Still, to the outside world, they were perfect until the first tragedy struck. It was the youngest child who fell ill. Doctors could not pinpoint the cause, only that the girl's condition worsened overnight. Rula stayed by her bedside, her face composed for the cameras, even as her daughter's breathing slowed. When the child died, the mother's grief looked flawless: the tears, the trembling voice, the public gratitude for sympathy. Yet the nurses whispered that something about her calmness was unnatural. Months later, The second child began to show the same symptoms: dizziness, fainting, heart irregularities. The hospital staff grew uneasy. One nurse noticed that the mother never left the room, insisting on managing every dose of medication. The father appeared lost, broken by grief, but still trusting the woman who smiled at every funeral with practiced grace. When the second girl died, suspicion took root. The doctors ordered an autopsy, but the mother resisted, calling it an insult to her child's memory. The request was delayed by paperwork and sympathy. The police noted nothing unusual. Rula's image, grieving mother, stoic survivor, continued to charm a nation. She appeared on talk shows, speaking about loss and faith. Her following grew. Then the eldest daughter, still alive, was admitted to the same hospital. This time, the doctors acted quietly, monitoring every visit, every injection. They replaced the IV fluid without warning and stationed an observer behind a glass wall. The mother arrived, carrying a smile and a thermos of homemade juice. Minutes later, the monitors began to alarm. Nurses rushed in to find the child gasping, eyes wide, unable to speak. When the mother was gently escorted from the room, her first words were not of fear, but outrage that someone would accuse her of harm after all she had suffered. The staff exchanged glances. They sent blood samples for testing, then called the police before the results even arrived. 2 days later, the toxicology report confirmed what everyone already suspected but could hardly say aloud. Lethal compounds present, matching those found in household cleaning agents. The hospital shut down the ward to prevent panic. The media caught wind of it within hours. Cameras filled the parking lot. The father, pale and trembling, gave one brief statement to the press, that he had trusted love too much. When officers arrived at the family home, Rula greeted them calmly, her hair perfectly arranged, her voice soft. She asked if they would like coffee before the arrest. As the detective reading the file reached this line, he closed the folder halfway and rubbed his temples. The words blurred together: faith, family, poison, performance. He thought of the patterns stretching across every story he had read: charm, trust, and betrayal blooming beneath the surface. He turned the page again, unwilling yet unable to stop. Outside, rain began to fall against the Mediterranean coast, tracing slow lines down the windows of a house now emptied of laughter. The neighbors spoke quietly, saying the same phrase again and again, that no storm, no matter how fierce, could wash away what had been done beneath that roof. The police began their work carefully, afraid of making a mistake in a case that had already broken hearts across the country. The sight of a mother accused of harming her own children was almost unthinkable. Investigators approached the Paspigu home with caution, but what they found there chilled them. The house looked frozen in time, toys neatly arranged, clothes folded, photographs framed in perfect symmetry. It was a shrine to normalcy, as if the mother had tried to preserve the life she had already erased. Rula greeted the detectives politely, her smile composed, her tone light. She wore black as if perpetually in mourning, yet her movements were graceful, rehearsed. She spoke with the confidence of someone used to cameras, correcting their questions, quoting medical terms she barely understood. When they asked about the children's final days, she recited each detail as if reading from a script, her voice steady, her eyes dry. Her husband, Manos, sat apart during questioning, his hands clasped tightly. For years, he had accepted her explanations, coincidences, genetic illness, fate. But as he listened to the officers describe the toxicology results, something in him cracked. He stared at the floor, realizing that grief had blinded him to the truth hiding in plain sight. When asked if he had ever doubted her, he whispered, only at night, when she smiled in her sleep. The forensic team searched the kitchen and found bottles of cleaning chemicals hidden behind flour and sugar. The labels had been peeled off. Traces of the same compounds appeared in cups and utensils. The evidence was silent but damning. They collected samples in sterile bags while Rula watched, expression unchanged. "I cleaned often," she said softly. "The house must always look beautiful." At the station, detectives reviewed her social media accounts. There she was, smiling beside hospital beds, posting captions about hope and prayer. The audience adored her. Each post had thousands of comments, strangers offering comfort, telling her she was strong, pure, blessed. The investigators saw the pattern forming. Grief as performance, sympathy as fuel. When the interrogation began, Rula denied everything. She said the hospitals were incompetent, that jealousy had made the nurses turn against her. She called the doctors liars and the press vultures. But as the evidence mounted, her composure began to fracture. When shown the lab report, she stared at it for a long time before whispering, "They were already gone. I only helped them rest." The room went silent. The detective leading the interview leaned forward and asked what she meant. Her eyes flicked toward the camera, recording the session. "I was a good mother," she said. "You don't understand how quiet the house becomes after the first one. You start hearing the walls breathe." Psychiatrists were brought in immediately. They spoke of narcissistic pathology, of someone addicted to attention, unable to exist without pity. She had transformed grief into identity. The deaths of her children had given her the stage she craved. And when the applause faded, she created new tragedy to reclaim it. Public reaction was violent. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse, shouting her name with fury. Former supporters turned on her, demanding punishment. Others refused to believe, insisting she had been framed. In cafes and living rooms, people argued over the line between madness and evil. The country was divided, its collective heart cracked by the idea that love could turn so cold. Manos withdrew from the world entirely. He moved to a small apartment near the port, speaking to no one. Reporters found him once, sitting alone on a bench, staring at the sea. When asked what he would say to his wife, he answered, "Nothing. She would only smile." The investigators filed their final report at dusk, the pages thick with evidence, yet thin on understanding. How does one measure intent when affection and destruction wear the same face? They closed the folder, knowing no sentence could restore what had been lost. That night, rain swept across Patras, washing salt from the air. The neighbors who once admired the family now crossed the street to avoid the house. Behind its locked shutters, the echo of laughter lingered faint, unreachable, like the memory of light after a storm. The courthouse in Patras stood beneath an unforgiving sun, its marble steps crowded with cameras and voices. Every major network in the country had sent reporters. Every headline had already chosen a side. The words "monster mother" appeared on screens before the trial even began. Inside, the air felt thin, heavy with expectation. People came not only for just. Rula Paspigu entered dressed in black once more, her hair pinned precisely, her eyes calm but unreadable. She moved with the slow grace of someone aware that every motion was being filmed. Her lawyers surrounded her, shielding her from the shouts that rose as she passed. "You killed your children," a man yelled. She turned her head slightly, her lips curving into something that looked too close to a smile. The prosecution opened with cold precision. They laid out the timeline, the evidence, the toxicology reports, the financial records showing insurance payments after each death. Each fact struck the courtroom like a hammer. The prosecutor's voice hardened when describing the final night, the thermos, the hospital cameras, the moment nurses burst into the room too late to save the eldest girl. The silence that followed was unbearable. When it was her turn to speak, Rula's voice was soft and deliberate. She told the court she loved H. The psychologist called by the prosecution described a pattern of manipulation so refined it bordered on performance art. He spoke of Munchausen syndrome by proxy, the compulsion to harm for sympathy. He described her need to remain at the center of grief, the way she weaponized pity until it became applause. Each word chipped away at her mask, yet she remained still, as if the accusations were lines in a play she had already memorized. Outside, crowds swelled. Some demanded her execution, others held signs reading, "Not guilty, she's ill, not evil." The noise echoed through the courthouse windows, a wave of outrage and confusion that blurred morality into spectacle. The nation watched every broadcast, every photograph, dissecting her expressions as though they held prophecy. In living rooms across Greece, families argued into the night. Could love truly twist into such darkness, or had society created her by worshiping image over truth? The verdict came after weeks of. When guards led her from the courtroom, the crowd outside erupted. Some threw flowers, others curses. The air was thick with heat and fury. The father, standing alone on the courthouse steps, whispered to a journalist that forgiveness was impossible. "She didn't kill them to end pain," he said. "She killed them to feel adored." The prison received her quietly. The warden reported that she adapted quickly, polite with staff, distant with inmates. She began organizing cleaning schedules, insisting on order, on perfection. The walls of her cell were spotless. When asked how she passed the time, she said she prayed for those who misunderstood her. At night, guards walking past her cell sometimes heard her speaking softly, as though addressing children just out of sight. "Sleep now," she would whisper. "Mama is here." The city tried to forget, but the story lingered on talk shows, in classrooms, in whispered warnings about the danger of beauty without empathy. The nation that once adored her now used her name as shorthand for deceit. Yet in some dark corner of the collective conscience, a question refused to fade. Did she act out of madness, or from the hollow hunger of a world that applauds suffering more than sincerity? As the detective closed the case file, rain began to fall outside again, blurring the edges of the world. The stories had changed countries and names, but their shape remained the same. Love twisted into possession, faith into power, care into destruction. Another file waited on the desk, its label still blank. The detective hesitated, staring at it, feeling the weight of every soul he had just read. Somewhere, in another town, another story was already beginning. The news of Rula Pasbegu's sentencing spread across the world within hours. In Greece, it filled television screens and newspaper columns. Abroad, it became a headline about madness disguised as motherhood. People who had never heard her name debated her guilt as though they had been in the courtroom themselves. Talk shows dissected her face, her tone, her posture. Was she evil or ill, or both? The world wanted answers, but the answers were. In Patras, the street where she once lived grew silent. The windows of the family home stayed shuttered, the paint beginning to peel under the relentless sun. Tourists slowed their cars to glimpse the house that had turned from symbol of dome. Her husband, Manos, left the city soon after the sentencing. He sold everything that bore her touch and moved to the mountains. A journalist found him months later, tending a small vineyard, his face older, his voice quiet. When asked if he could forgive her, he said forgiveness required understanding, and there was nothing to understand. She loved the reflection, not the children, he said. When the mirror cracked, she broke everything that reminded her of light. In prison, Rula continued to maintain her routines. The staff described her as calm, disciplined, unnervingly cheerful. She requested new sheets every week and insisted her cell remain spotless. She began holding prayer circles for other inam. Outside those walls, the nation wrestled with its own reflection. Talk of reform filled the parliament, stricter hospital oversight, improved mental health programs, mandatory investigations in repeated family deaths. Yet behind the bureaucracy lay a simpler truth. People wanted to believe that evil always announces itself, that monsters look like monsters. Rula's smile shattered that illusion. Years passed, and documentaries followed. Actors portrayed her story, authors wrote books about her, and audiences watched in grim fascination. Each retelling blurred the lines a little more, until she became both villain and myth. Some pitied her, others feared her, but almost everyone felt compelled to look. It was as if society, staring at her, saw its own obsession with image reflected back. At the edge of the city, a small chapel held candles for the three daughters. Their names were carved into marble beneath the words, "May innocence outlive memory." Every year, strangers left flowers there. Mothers knelt beside their children, whispering prayers against envy, vanity, and the hollow hunger for attention. They lit candles not just for the victims, but for themselves, hoping never to understand the kind of emptiness that could turn affection into poison. One autumn evening, the detective who had followed the case visited the chapel. He lit 3 candles and stood in silence, the scent of wax and salt air mingling around him. He thought of all the files he had read: the preacher, the elevator, the nurse, the vanished girl, each one different yet stitched together by the same thread, love corrupted by the desire to control. He wondered if these stories were warnings or mirrors. Outside, the sea. He turned back toward his car, the folder tucked under his arm. A new report awaited him at the station, another missing child, another mother insisting on innocence, another beginning that already felt like an ending. Rain began to fall again, soft at first, then steady, the same rhythm that had accompanied every story before. The world kept turning, indifferent yet haunted, each drop carrying a question that no verdict could answer. Night has fallen again, soft rain whispering against the windows of a quiet room. The detective sits alone at his desk, the lamp burning low, the last file from the archive spread open before him. Around him lie the remnants of every story he has read, photos curled at the corners, transcripts smudged with fingerprints, names underlined in fading ink. 5 cases, 5 different countries, yet the same pattern running like a vein through them all. The faces change, but the hunger does not. He closes his eyes and hears the voices: Brooke's sister calling into the empty courtyard, the nurse whispering that she would not be afraid, the friend from Hong Kong begging for forgiveness, the preacher reciting scripture as the soil gave up its secrets, the father from Greece murmuring that he once trusted love too much. Each voice overlaps until they sound like rain. It is not noise but memory, a choir of grief that refuses silence. He understands now that none of these stories are about monsters hiding in the dark. They are about ordinary people, carrying wounds too deep to name, until one moment of weakness or pride or pain turns them into something unrecognizable. The true horror lies not in what they did, but in how close they once were to all of us. He thinks of the survivors, Stephanie, still lighting candles for her sister, the nurse's parents sending letters no one reads, a Jen walking beside the sea, the families who found their faith cracked but not gone. They keep living because someone must. Their endurance is what redeems the rest of us. Outside, thunder rolls far away over the hills. The detective rises, closing the final folder. He stacks it with the others, each one heavier than the last. For a long time, he watches the rain slide down the glass, tracing crooked paths like the lives he has followed. Somewhere out there, more stories are waiting, beginnings disguised as ordinary days, endings already taking shape beneath calm surfaces. He turns off the lamp and stands in the dark. The room feels different now, not haunted but sacred, like a chapel built from truths too painful to forget. He whispers a line he once heard from a victim's mother. We survive by remembering. The words linger in the air, simple and final. Then he reaches for his coat, ready to step back into the storm. The rain greets him like an old companion, steady and familiar. He breathes it in, the scent of earth and electricity, and feels something shift, not relief, not peace, but acceptance. Justice, he knows, is imperfect. Compassion is harder, but remembering, truly remembering, is the only form of mercy that lasts. He walks down the empty street, past shuttered windows and flickering lights, until his figure disappears into the gray distance. Behind him, the rain keeps falling, washing the world clean in small, stubborn ways. And for tonight, that is enough.